This is our league, and this is your league. From the 55-yard line on CFL America Radio and the Sports History Network.
A Football Life is presented by Chase.
You're looking at an unusual story here, and a person in myself who can go back and remember the sights and sounds and smells of the first time I ever put on a football uniform. I remember being in 4th grade, and I can still remember the feel of the leather pads on my shoulders and the way they smelled. To me, football was all about myth.
Life is great. Football is better. Steve Sabol.
And I think he really believed that. His whole life was NFL films.
Basically, I think he saw his life through the camera and how it was going to be projected on the screen.
I think my brother thought in frames. Yeah, and story, drama.
Steve Sabol was the greatest sports filmmaker ever. The thing that Steve should most be remembered for is he loved what he did every single day of his life, and that's why he was so great.
He never stopped loving football.
You know the Kermit the Frog in the Muppets? And he has a great line. He says, "I always knew what I wanted to be even before my tail fell off." And even when I was a little tadpole, I knew this was the first time I ever sat in front of a little editing machine in 1962 and had film and ran through. I just knew, I said, if John Facenda was here, I'd say, this was your destiny.
You're going to be a football player when you grow up.
Today is the best day of your life. Believe it.
He might be the finest quarterback produced in the last 10 years.
He's someday like, that's all I need.
Fortunately for me, I didn't lose my life, didn't lose my job. Football convinced me that life is a team game.
Rest of your life, nobody can ever tell you that you couldn't do it.
In honor and recognition of both Ed and Steve Sabol's contributions to the National Football League, and as an everlasting memorial to Steve, we're officially changing our address. Effective now, will forever be One Sabol Way. When you walk back into the building, you'll see a new picture in the lobby of Steve and his dad with one of his favorite sayings, "Life is great, football is better." And finally, one of Steve's very, very favorite music compositions was A Hero Remembered. As Kenny Smith raises a flag in Steve's memory that will fly here at NFL Films, I thought it would be an opportune time for us each to remember our hero, Steve.
Steve Sabol's two passions were football and film. By combining them, he helped turn the sport he loved into America's passion.
I think we got it.
Jackie Robinson said, "A life is not important except in the impact it has on other lives. Steve's impact on those who knew him as a friend, teammate, son, brother, husband, and boss was life-altering. But what Steve discovered in the 18 months he lived after learning he had brain cancer was what a profound impact he had on thousands of people he had only briefly, or more often than not, never even met.
Dear Mr. Sabol.
Dear Steve.
Dear Mr. Sabol.
Hi, Steve.
He was always the kind of guy that if someone would write him a letter, he would write back. And he was just like, how am I ever going to respond to these? And he was just like overwhelmed.
Dear Mr. Sabol.
Dear Mr. Sabol. Dear Steve.
Hi, Steve.
You don't know me.
You don't know me.
You don't know me.
But I feel I know you.
If I know you.
I know we've never met.
Although I have never met you, I feel like I have.
I feel I've known you my whole life.
Mr. Sabol, I'm a 48-year-old father of 3 children.
I am a woman of 67 years old.
I am a
78-year-old grandmother.
I'm 40 and I always remember you being there.
As with millions of other NFL fans,
A million fans.
you have had an impact on my life.
You have made a massive impact on my life.
You made the game matter to me.
You have no idea the impact you've had on so many lives.
This film is both their story and his. The story of a perfect football life. When we return, Sudden Death Sabol, the fearless tot from Possum Trot.
Dear Mr. Sabol, I'm writing to tell you that the world is a better place for what you have given it. You have provided me with more memories than just about anyone that I have never met ever could. I know and love the NFL, know and love football, know and love Sunday afternoons, surrounded by family and friends because of NFL films.
We leave you with some final images.
If everyone loved what they did as much as you have and do, the world would be a much better place.
Thank you, everybody.
Steve Sabol's world was well documented from the very beginning.
NFL Films began with a 16mm Bell & Howell movie camera that my dad had gotten as a wedding present. And everything that I did as his first and only son, from my first pony ride, my first haircut, my first football game, he captured on film. He filmed every football game that I played in from the time I was in 4th grade until the time I was a senior in high school.
We played the single wing in those days. I was an end, Steve was a tailback, and it was clear that Steve knew more about football than any of the rest of us. He, at least at Haverford, was a thoroughly mediocre football player.
It was off the field where Sabol excelled at Haverford, a private school in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
I was second in my class. I was one of those guys that, in your yearbook, there was like 70 lists, cum laude society, signet society, speaking contest, all that. And they told me, coming from Harvard School, well, you can go any place you want.
So Steve applied to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. He didn't have what we now call a safety school because nobody thought there was any reason to have a safety school.
I didn't do well on my college boards, and I got a letter back, thanks, but no thanks, you're on the waiting list.
Steve was turned down at all 3. It was a shock. Haverford had never had anything like that.
So there I was in the middle of the summer.
Unbeknownst to Steve, his mother began applying him to colleges around the country.
Well, you've been accepted at North Dakota State Spearfish Teachers College. You've been accepted at TCU. You're accepted at the University of Miami. Then I got this thing. You were accepted at Colorado College. And the first thing that came to my mind was Dutch Clark. He was a Hall of Fame football player, played for the Lions, played at Colorado College. And I said, well, that sounds sort of neat. And then I saw a picture of the mountains, and I said, that's where I'm going to go. If I ever wrote a book, I would have 2 chapters just on Colorado College.
He was coming to the West, and he could just reinvent himself.
He never told us his whole story. He just filled it in a little bit. He was from Pennsylvania, Joe Namath country. That's where I'm from. Yeah. Chuck McNair.
He was determined to make an impression on his new teammates. So the official game program read, Steve Sabol, fullback, Coaltown, PA.
If you say you're from Philadelphia, you know, that's not going to cut it.
Well, Cold Town worked well for the first year or so, but Steve, being the great marketer that he is, decided that he had to do something different. He'd made the initial impression, so he moved. He was geographically mobile, and he moved to Possum Trot, Mississippi.
Steve has a great flair for BS artistry. He made up a whole world around himself that was hilarious.
He knew what would be good copy.
It helped that Sabol was the one writing the copy.
The programs, we didn't really know he was writing them. It was all done just off somewhere by himself.
I had an ad. It said, "The Possum Trot Chamber of Commerce wishes its favorite son, Sudden Death Sabol, a successful season."
Sudden Death?
Well, I gave myself a nickname.
Sudden Death?
Oh, yeah, you had to have a nickname. Sudden Death was my initials, Stephen Douglas Sabol.
Sudden death, boom. He liked that stuff. Sudden death, blood and thunder.
I was all conference, led the nation in punting for about 2 weeks. And then I lifted weights for a whole year. I went from 165 to 205.
Come on.
Yeah, did a lot of banana milkshakes, boy.
The little tot from Possum Trot transformed himself into Mr. Philadelphia.
To me, it looked like what Steve was doing, I mean, and they could only assess this from looking back on this, is that Steve was building a brand, and he was the brand, and he was feeling it out as he was going along. He'd get T-shirts for little kids that said, "I'm a little possum trotter," or something like that. And then he sent all this information off to the newspapers, and they bought it.
The man who would become pro football's great myth maker was cutting his teeth. The first myth Steve Sabol ever made was his own.
A 4-page spread in Sports Illustrated. There ain't never been anything like that.
If I was a player and I was going to be playing for the Jets this season.
You know, I remember you when you were a player, in case you want to know.
I know.
I coached against the team that you played on.
I averaged 6 yards a carry against your defense.
I think it was 4.1 rounded off to 5.0. Now, I don't know what school of economics
because
you're allowed to do that.
I was also the public relations department. It was a small school.
I took my talent as far as I could. And one of the proudest moments of my life was when I was elected captain of the football team at Colorado College. That meant more to me at that time than anything else I'd ever done.
Sabol's true talents had only begun to emerge. And when his father's hobby of shooting football games became something more, Ed Sabol knew where to look for help.
I got a call from my father, and I always remember this phone call. He said, "You know, I can see by your grades that all you've been doing out there is playing football and going to the movies. But that makes you uniquely qualified for this profession." So I left school over the Christmas holidays and helped my dad film and edit the 1962 championship game. And that's where it all started.
I'm standing in the NFL Films Library. There's 6,000 miles of film in here. I've shot some of it, edited a lot of it, and seen all of it. I'm Steve Sabol of NFL Films.
Steve was responsible for the total look of NFL Films, from the scripts.
Frightfully instead of frighteningly.
I'm glad you said it.
Okay.
Most importantly, the music.
We're ready for another session, Sam.
Hey, wonderful.
And listen, I got some ideas, and as usual, I'll be sending you a tape, and you'll hear in this tape the way these trumpets come in, and I think this is Goosebump City here.
The camera work. He was a cameraman himself.
I really thought, I'd be honest with you, I thought this was going to be a lot heavier than it is.
Get
He was the first producer, editor for the use of montage. So all that was passed on to later generations and became the look and style of NFL Films.
When I look back and I think of the way we started, it was just 4 or 5 people Young guys who loved to make movies and who loved pro football and wanted to convey our love of the game to our audience.
Steve was the most single-minded person I've ever met. And he was single-minded in only one thing. It was making films, seeing us making films, developing NFL films. I mean, this was his whole life.
This is our 6th Super Bowl. And I think when you talk about competition in sports, we have competition in NFL films too. And tomorrow, our fiercest competitor will be ourselves. We've got to be better than we've ever been. We've got to make this one our best effort ever.
I've never seen anyone so passionate to come to work every single day. His films were passionate. That was the element that was never used in sports films. Passion.
Throwing under pressure, throws his pass. Caught by Clark. Clark got a touchdown. And it's caught out of the air. The ball is pulled in by Franco Harris. Harris is going for a touchdown.
As a kid growing up watching NFL films, those films stirred me. Steve took us inside the face masks into the souls of the men playing the game. He just really understood filmmaking, and so he was able to take this incredibly dramatic subject, an understanding of Hollywood filmmaking. Nobody had ever put the two together. Steve did. Steve wins.
I think of the impact that Hollywood's had on me as a kid, seeing Duel in the Sun with Gregory Peck and Jennifer Jones, and they're climbing up this mountain. It was all this great music, and you just saw their bloody hands trying to climb up the mountain. And I remember seeing that, well, geez, why can't we do that with football? Why don't we shoot a telephoto lens and just get on Dick Butkus's hands, or just show the line of scrimmage with the fingers twitching? There's a whole story there.
The hands of combat, the hands of pros.
In the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of experimentation going on, and I would see a man and a woman. Claude Lelouch was the director and saw certain things in that and wanted to transfer that into football.
Steve saw in movies that all the characters aren't full frame, there's stuff in the frame. Steve did copy filmmaker techniques, especially in the interview with Willie Davis from the More Than a Game. He shot Willie Davis in the background, and in the foreground were all these bottles. He just took it to an extreme, which I don't think it really worked, but it was interesting.
Lessons in football.
We did a film called They Call It Pro Football, and that was the Citizen Kane sports films at the time. The music was different. John Facenda was the narrator.
It starts with a whistle and ends with a gun. 60 minutes of close-in action from kickoff to touchdown. This is pro football, the sport of our time.
It starts with a whistle and ends with a gun. I get chills when I hear that, because my dad was, and we looked at each other, and it was one of those moments, the eureka, this is going to be different. I've always believed in making films that you make the little decisions with your head, but you make the big decisions with your heart. I've always strived for those moments that you get chills or goosebumps.
I was a freshman at Notre Dame in September of 1982, and they released Wake Up the Echoes the same weekend. There were so many good lines in it.
Beneath a giant birch tree, where
Father Soren once sat smoking a peace pipe with the Indians, rests the bones of Newt Rockne. His spirit has yet to be buried.
His spirit has yet to be buried.
I mean, I just got goosebumps right then. My name is Pete Pranica, originally from Sobieski, Wisconsin. Steve, many years ago as a college student, you helped me with a term paper on how NFL films help to shape the image of the NFL. I parlayed my love of sports and media into the play-by-play job with the Memphis Grizzlies of the NBA. I wanted to write a term paper that showed how somebody could take a subject that we were all very familiar with and give it a different perspective. And I called NFL Films and left a message. One day I get a phone call. Pete, this is Steve Sabol. You want to talk about this term paper? And so we had a good 20-minute conversation. I made a photocopy of the term paper, and I sent it to Steve, and I said, Steve, thank you for taking the time to do this. And he sent me a note back saying, well, the professor gave you an A, but I'm giving you an A+. When you think about the life of Steve Sabol, you really can't compare him to anybody else. He had the mind of a philosopher, the soul of a poet, the eye of a cinematographer, and in his heart, he had the passion of a football player, and that makes him an incredibly unique individual, and we'll never see his like again.
When you think about Lombardi,
when we return,
let me just get I lost my train of thought. Your answer was so good that, does this ever happen to you when you're doing an interview?
No.
You don't?
My name is Tim Strow. I'm an elementary school teacher in Sacramento, California. I've been recording these podcasts for my students. It's a little radio show that tells them what they're going to be learning about that week. So I started to email a lot of radio personalities, movie trailer voices, just about anybody that I can think of that would have the equipment to record an introduction. And so I'm at home, I'm grading papers, and I'm watching NFL Network. NFL Films comes on, and there's Mr. Sabol. And I went, Steve Sabol, I wonder if he'd do one. And so I looked up NFL Films, and I sent off an email. A couple of weeks later, here comes an email, and here's an introduction from Mr. Sabol.
Hi, my name is Steve Sabol, president of NFL Films.
This is great. This is really great. This is awesome.
I'm looking forward to a new season of the NFL and also a new school year of Mr. Strau's podcasts.
I just felt like all of a sudden I was a good friend of his, even though I had never met him.
Like so many football fans his age, Mr. Strow grew up watching Steve Sabol on television.
This is going to be good. I can see this.
Yeah. I think he was reluctant to go on camera at first, but we did so many on-camera shows. At first, it was a cost savings method. We didn't want to pay all these people to come in, so Steve started doing it, and I think he found that he really liked it, and he was really good at it.
This time they meet, I'm going to pick Green Bay, Harry. I think the Packers will have no problem passing that pig pelt into the promised land.
It would be all season long.
As a filmmaker, Steve's scripts were crisp and terse.
And it's a good line, and I don't want to change the thought.
But as a host, the lover of the language was the master of the metaphor.
This is like Fred Flintstone versus Luke Skywalker. If they look in a mirror now, they'll see that their Bo Derek season's looking more and more like Phyllis Diller.
It was like watching Baryshnikov in a gathering of slam dancers. It was if, Andy Warhol was directing the Three Stooges. It was like...
There was no comparison he wouldn't make.
Goosed Jackrabbit, just staying a step ahead of the hounds.
Not since Dr. Victor Frankenstein scoured the Transylvanian countryside.
No skit he wouldn't perform.
Our first story is about an offensive lineman who played for the 49ers in the 50s.
Well, let me say this about that.
You spent a lot of time with this 49er team. You know them. You'll know how they respond.
Yes, I do, Charlie. They think of themselves as a separate breed within their own game.
And no question he wouldn't ask.
What are the duties of the piss boy? Were you under any medication? What does he smell like?
You ever get hit with a meat pie? That might be worse than an ice ball is getting hit by a meat pie.
He truly was the face of the National Football League.
Hi,
he was a celebrity.
Oh, everybody knows who Steve Sabol is.
I'm honored that Steven Spielberg would come out his busy day to interview me. Hey, but you ain't answered the question. Where all the money?
There is no money. The money's being spent.
You do it on your wardrobe.
I know it isn't.
You ain't doing it on your wardrobe. Let me tell you.
When Steve interviewed either players or coaches, I think he thought he was one of them. He wasn't like, some schlub interviewing him and sort of scared of Bill Parcells.
You guys need gas money back to Philly?
After all this film reviews, maybe we do. All right, get out of here.
Or in awe of Tom Brady. It was like almost a friend interviewing a friend.
Tom Brady, poor build. That might be accurate.
I would probably agree.
He was sort of so down to earth and didn't realize it. And he could talk to you on almost every subject.
Thanks for being with us.
For 10 years, I would interview Steve Sabol before the Super Bowl. He departed more knowledge about the game and the players and the whole sense of professional football, but he would weave in the Sistine Chapel.
The Colts defense is like the floor of the Sistine Chapel.
He would weave in Jack Bauer.
Roethlisberger to me is like, I don't know whether you watch 24. He's like Jack Bauer.
Doc Holliday.
Doc Holliday once said about Wyatt Earp, about why he was so great in a bar fight. And he said Wyatt would pull his pistol, he'd shoot at you with a pistol. If he missed you with a pistol, he'd flip it over, hit you over the head with a butt, and then kick you in the crotch on the way down. That's the way the Patriots come at you.
And the first time I did it at Bloomberg, my producer came up to me, and we had done a lot of pretty important figures, Barack Obama and people like that, and said, I've never seen anything like it. This guy speaks in eloquent paragraphs. He's the most articulate person I've ever heard in my life.
Does that surprise you?
It does.
That a football
And he could talk with anyone.
You know, football and golf are just not synonymous with one another.
We wanted to.
You ever been to a Super Bowl?
I've been to every one. I mean, come on, I hope we got that on camera. Now, you're not even out of breath.
But he was never happier than when he was talking football with the greats of the game.
Yeah, I see.
It was such a relaxed format that he could just draw them out and probably have them talk about things they would never talk about with anyone else.
Jim, if you had to go back and look over your life, is there one broken friendship that you would like to repair?
Well, that's a deep question. Well, I give you a real honest answer. My mother.
This January 2011 interview was the last one Steve Sabol ever conducted.
Thanks for doing this.
Happy to do it. Thanks for coming out.
All right. I came up specially for this.
Coach Belichick said, Steve never goes anywhere.
I don't. I'm retired. You brought me out of retirement for this,
Really?
so you better be good. We're depending on you.
I'll try.
Have a seat. Let's roll.
And it was hard. I remember taking a walk with my dad and mom around the block.
What'd your dad say to you?
It was just a tough day, you know. I just remember being there with my mom and dad. Sorry about that. And thank God I got picked here.
Do you know
that? Oh man.
We did it.
Thanks, Steve.
All right. I really appreciate you doing this for us.
Yeah,
I know
my
this
pleasure.
is busy, but I wouldn't have sent that to you unless it was really important.
Yeah.
But thanks for it. Now, like I
Always
said,
let me know.
hey,
I love everything that you guys do and you've done.
We don't want to abuse the relationship.
When I think of Lombardi, I'm always reminded of that famous painting of the feisty old sea captain looking out into a stormy sea. And underneath the picture is the caption, "Take a good look at me, for you shall not see my likes again." I'm Steve Sabol.
The same could be said about Steve Sabol, a man whose work will live on in our minds, our reruns, and our podcasts.
You'll hear him. He'll be alive here at our school campus forever because I'll use him every year.
Welcome to Mr. Strauss Podcast.
My name is Bob Mueller, and I live in Prince Edward Island. The first year I played football was 1969. The football coach had a film, and it was the Butkus film. The thing that interested me was that picture of Butkus and his hands and the mud and the blood and the rain. Everything about that was artistic. From that interest, I started becoming an artist. Butkus had been the image, but it was Steve's eye for art that I'd followed. Steve influenced my life as an artist and gave me the confidence to keep on going.
There are many ways to mold an artist. For Steve Sabol, the greatest influences were set in stone during his childhood. Some of his creative genes were inherited from his father, Ed. But Steve also found inspiration on the other side of his family tree.
My mother ran an art gallery in Philadelphia. And she was the first person to recognize the value of what was then called pop art. Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Roy Lichtenstein, Wayne Thiebaud, Ed Ruscha, the artists that she would have in her gallery would come to our house for dinner.
Art was always important in my life, and how it passed on to Steve, I think the conversation at home was either art or football. So it was really that way that he probably picked up on both ends.
To me, seeing somebody that had a box of Brillo pads and calling it art, or someone that was just painting an American flag, that all of a sudden really fascinated me. I thought that is really something that's considered art. And that's what I wanted to major in when I went to college, was mixed media.
I kind of had the feeling, well, maybe he's going to go, you know, open a gallery and buy expensive paintings. I mean, he could have done that as much as anything.
Instead, he chose NFL films. But he brought with him an art school approach.
When we started to cover the games, we have a ground cameraman that was called a mole. Then we had a top cameraman who was called a tree. But I thought there was something missing. To go back to my art background, Cezanne said that all art is selected detail. You know, the cleat marks in the mud, the rays of the sun coming through the stadium. And then I became a weasel. And that's what I shot, was just these details. And with these details integrated with our great action cameraman and our great top cameraman, you had a blending of all these elements that you could really tell a story.
And this is essentially the same technique that Pablo Picasso and George Braque, the famous Cubist painters of the 1930s, used. Now, they did it with a woman's face or a bowl of fruit. We're using a post pattern or a draw play.
In the very beginning, I think Steve was very tunnel-visioned about football. And I think when he got together with Penny Ashman, that changed a lot of my brother's life because she was an active artist.
When we first started going together, we started making cards and things for each other, and that just sort of grew into making collages. Usually in the summertime, when he wasn't doing football, he would spend a lot of time in the art room, and he was very prolific during that time.
He was also prolific at finding materials for his work.
Well, I'm a collector of what I would call incidental miscellanea, which it's sort of objects that people look at and dismiss and overlook.
We have marble drawers, we have drawers with pool balls, we have pieces of furniture that contain rubber stamps, we have books just devoted to strange women, we have books full of cigarette cards. It is an incredible organization of junk.
Like the pop artists he met in his youth, Sabol spent his later years turning the mundane into magic.
One of the things that I've always believed about making movies, and I also think it's true of art, is you got to get a good beginning and a good ending and get them as close together as possible. So I came up with this particular phrase, whiskey my vice, so was he. And this is Bobby Lane, a notorious womanizer and boozer. A lot of the things that I like to do are obviously a play on words. And one of the most famous of all football cliches is on any given Sunday. And I just thought this guy's face, when you think of him, it just makes you feel good. He was an actual member of the New York Giants in the 1920s. His name was Shipwreck Kelly. When I was in art school, one of the things that I learned is that composition is the blending together of unequal parts. And I always think that's interesting, to take as many different things and see if you can construct something that's sort of pleasing to the eye or tells the story.
I think what he was doing came naturally out of editing and cutting film. I mean, he was cutting it and then putting it together. So I think that was a sort of a natural evolvement.
When you think of making a film, you're really making a collage. You're taking bits of film and matching those film to music, to script, to sound effects. So there is a corollary between the two.
I think both in film and in artwork, he was just really good at putting divergent images together and creating something completely different.
I think someone else who tried to do that, it would be schlocky. But they were genuine pieces of art. I mean, they were incredibly interesting pieces.
Today, Steve Sabol's camera work fills the vault at NFL Films, and his collages still line its hallways, inspiring those who follow in his footsteps.
What Steve wanted to do with art was to create a sense of life. That sounds like a cliche, but that sense of vibrancy. That was Steve. I mean, Steve's life was about vibrancy.
Those pieces, in some way, probably represent the game of football, but to me, they're more self-portraits.
Coming up, father, son, and the perfect ending.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You wake up one day and you realize you're 24, you're 25 years old, you've got all this credit card debt and this frivolous debt, and you've done nothing that you'd set out to do. Mr. Sabol, I have never written a letter of any kind to a celebrity or public figure, but I wanted to take a moment to tell you how important your work has been to my life. Moving back home was pretty embarrassing, and I would come home from work on those Monday evenings, watch the tail end of Monday Night Football, flip over to ESPN and sit and watch those NFL films. I'm convinced that your films were the impetus for my return to school. Their dramatic tones, the way they glorified the game I love, the way they depicted the men who played and coached the game, spoke to me like nothing else. Literally physically sitting down while those videos were playing and making a list for myself of a 3-year plan to pay off the debt, to go back to school and finish the last 2 years and to get a job. Your work touched my life, and mine has touched thousands. I am currently preparing to enter my 19th year as a coach and English teacher. Without you, none of that would have been possible. Fight the good fight, sir. There are many out here that love your work, and by proxy, love you. I really forgot all the things that I included in this letter. It kind of took me by surprise.
Nothing lasts unless it can be expressed in terms of the human spirit. And I think in some way, with our music, our pictures, and our script, we are expressing that human spirit through the sport of football.
I got a word, you say that.
Steve Sabol spent his professional life turning football players into heroes. But his own hero never played it down and could always be found at Steve's side.
I think Steve worshipped his father. His father was like this bigger-than-life character. They were like business partners that didn't really behave like business partners. They were more like friends.
I think they were truly like a very older brother and a younger brother rather than a father and son.
I don't think, as I look back, that Steve and I had a typical father-son relationship. I think we loved each other in a very quiet way. I think we got through life pretty good.
And after a lifetime of recognition, there was just one more award Steve wanted his father to experience.
My father wasn't well. Steve came out to tell him Thanksgiving that he could possibly make it to the Hall of Fame. And Steve said, "Dad, you gotta live to get this induction." He said, "This is the most important thing to me."
Ed granted Steve his wish, as did the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
We were at the Super Bowl in Dallas Saturday night to watch the announcements. And I must tell you, I've never seen Steve so nervous in my life. And now they announced.
The fifth name on our list is Ed Sabol.
Of course, all the media now wanted to talk to Steve, wanted to put him on NFL Network, etc. And Steve said, "Well, I'm not sure." He said, "What am I going to say?" I said, you at a loss of words in front of the TV cameras? You'll be just fine.
There's so many things that went through our mind at this moment. And as a son, to me, it's really a story. And at this moment, we're all here to celebrate my dad.
Cut to March 5th.
NFL Films president Steve Sabol is in stable condition in a Kansas City hospital after suffering a seizure at an awards dinner there on Saturday night. Sabol is awake and alert after undergoing a series of tests over the weekend.
And the diagnosis came down, and obviously it wasn't a good one. Prognosis, tumor on the brain, affecting his speech.
It was probably the worst thing that could have happened to him. I mean, he could have lost a leg or an arm. That wouldn't have mattered. His strength and his way of expressing himself was, of course, through speech. This really hit at the most important part of his life.
Despite intense radiation treatments, Sabol never missed a day of work at NFL Films.
Thomas Jefferson said every man's work is always a portrait of himself.
He dealt with it well. I mean, he was pretty upbeat about it and pretty funny about it.
I'll tell you, I might have been the toughest talk, the toughest take I've done in my whole career. Really, to get that out. Yeah.
I just admired that he never let it get him down too much.
There's so many things that are going through my mind that I can't explain, but I can just say that what's going on right here, is here more in my heart.
We were very open about, the vulnerability of both Steve and Dad. Would we get there, as a family?
The Sabols were not about to let illness get in the way of a good story.
Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Ed Sabol for enshrinement into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Steve Sabol.
And I think it was a magical moment for my father and my brother. They made it, they got it, they lived to see it, both of them. I don't think it gets any better than that.
Not bad, huh?
It was such a huge accomplishment for both of them. I've never seen him so happy as the day that his father accepted his statue. I mean, his face was lit up. He was just so happy.
Well, that's another show.
They made it, again, father, son, great ending.
Where do we play next week, Steve?
Live on NFL Network, reporting news that none of us can believe. Steve Sabol, the president of NFL Films, has passed away due to complications from a brain tumor. It is beyond belief that this weekend's games, week 3 of the 2012 season, will be the first in over half a century in which Steve Sabol will not be with us to enjoy. Once again, Steve Sabol has passed away at the age of 69.
Life is temporary, but an artist lives on forever. In the hearts of those who knew him best, and those who got to know him through his work.
Your voice, your films, synonymous with my childhood, my life, and my love of football.
Steve was really a secure man. He was really comfortable with who he was and what he did.
Your love of grace and your disarming smile are infectious, Mr. Sabol, and I will carry them with me my whole life.
I really don't think Steve had any regrets. And how could he? He had the perfect life.
You made us laugh. You made us cry. You made us cheer. You made us dream.
He was a good guy that made great films, which I think pretty much is the way he is.